So pleased to be joined by someone I've known for a while, Mr. Northeast Wrestling, Brian Anthony. Brian, welcome to Under the Ring Pro Wrestling Conversations. So happy you're with me today.
Yeah, Phil, thanks for having me. When you were inviting me on here, I think I told you briefly, I get asked to do these things all the time. Never really been interested, never really been my thing. But for you, anything for Phil.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's start off with what's new with you. What are you up to in Northeast Wrestling these days?
Yeah, so if you're following Northeast, for the past couple of years, ever since we came back from the pandemic, it was Vito and myself came back as Mr. Northeast Wrestling and, had a series of matches with Eddie Kingston, Danny Maff. It was after that fourth title run. And a couple months back, some things happened, and now I'm on my own. There's no more Vito with me.
Who is Vito exactly, for people who don't know? Because he kind of just sort of materialized with you, and somebody had mentioned to me that he had been a friend of yours for a long time. He kind of sort of became your manager in the meantime too.
Yeah, so to give a very, very incredibly long story, a very short synopsis. Basically, Vito and I became friends back in probably 2006, 7-ish. I was training at Paul Roma's wrestling school. And Vito and his partner Lou were there. They were like working on some radio shows, things like that. They really loved wrestling. They wanted to do some kind of podcast back in the day, like before podcast for podcast. Right. They were doing like some radio thing, and got to meet them at Roma's school. They started a small wrestling promotion in the Northeast called Power and Glory Wrestling, obviously named after Roma. Mm-hmm. So worked with those guys, for a couple of years. Was a staple at Power and Glory. Me and Vito and Lou, you might see him at ringside at Northeast Wrestling with the camera. We all became really close friends, and just even outside of wrestling, just really tight, would hang out, do things, and as time passed and eventually Power and Glory closed, we all kind of did our own thing. I found myself in Northeast Wrestling. Naturally, I want my boys there. So, eventually Vito came on board. He was ringing the bell for a little while, doing camera stuff at ringside. Lou would do some of the editing videos. He would do some recording at ringside. And then as social media grew, he got involved in doing that. So, yeah, me and Vito go way back to the mid-2000s. And, how we got involved in Northeast Wrestling is we always joked one day he was going to be my manager. So I think it was 2016 or maybe 17. I had come back from a little time off and won the King of Bethany tournament. So once I became king, the next show I said, wow, I really need a royal introduction, So I'm scrambling the day of the show to try and think who could do this? Who could give me this big introduction? We'll have a scroll. And, I bought green fabric to walk down to the ring, like a green carpet. And so I'm in the locker room almost having a panic attack. Who can do this? I'm like, wait a minute. Vito, you got a suit? He's like, I got a suit. Vito, just because he was the guy with the suit, is introducing me. And, one thing led to another. It took off, and, it really became half my presentation was Vito's ring introductions of me as the king. So after the first time, it was funny. It was like this transition where he gave me this great introduction, but, Northeast Wrestling, the powers that be, if you will, still weren't sold on him being at ringside all the time. So the first show or two where I was the king, Vito introduced me and then just vanished into the locker room. And then as it progressed, you would start to see him at ringside more and more and more. And then before you know it, he was literally half my presentation.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Just because I've been watching Northeast for a long time, watching you in Northeast for a long time, and he really just kind of seemed to come out of nowhere for me. So I just started asking around, where'd this guy come from? Who is he? They're like, oh, it's Brian's friend. Don't worry about it. I'm like, oh,
yeah, no, I mean, that's really what it was. Is me and Vito have just been friends for a long time. We became super close. I mean, he was one of my best friends in the world, and then it lined up where him and Lou were essentially doing all of my presentation before the king, where they would do my videos and the editing and the voiceovers and all that. And we had always, wanted to have this opportunity on camera where they could be involved. And then it just so happened that I needed a guy with a suit, and there was Vito with a suit. I mean, who carries a top hat just to a wrestling show when he's not booked? But it worked out.
So you're probably more associated with Northeast Wrestling than almost anybody I can think of. What about that promotion and you is such an easy fit?
It's really, it was always something I wanted to do even before I got into independent wrestling, if you will. I grew up in the Danbury area. Danbury was a staple for Northeast wrestling. So there was times that I would go to those shows and say, like, oh, I want to be on these shows someday. And I remember when I was just breaking in, still training. I started training under Jason Knight in 2004, later moved on to Paul Roma. But I hooked up with Kurt Adonis in that time period at training. He came in and he was like, hey, you really seem to love this. I think you're going to be good, all this stuff. Started working with me. And he says, I work for this company, Northeast Wrestling. He's like, you've got to get involved. And so he hooked me up with Michael Lombardi. And at the time, I was still training, but I would go to, for example, like the Danbury WWE house shows when they would do the O'Neill Center and just hand out flyers, posters, whatever they wanted, help sell tickets, promote. I would get there and just help set up chairs, things like that. So around 2006, 2007, I started bothering Mike to use me on his shows. And he's like, no, I'm never going to use you. And like, literally would tell me right to my face, like, no, I'm never going to use you. And then
sounds like him.
Yeah, no. And then, comes to 2007, they come to Danbury and, Mike's a smart guy. He probably figured like, this kid can sell a bunch of tickets. And so he gave me a shot on the show and I sold a bunch of tickets. And the show actually got snowed out. It was like a freak snowstorm in the middle of March. So I think he probably felt bad for me. So he ended up having me debut at his next show, which was in Bristol in 2007. I think it was WrestleFest 11, maybe. I wrestled Jason Blade. So he gave me a shot there. It was supposed to be a one and done thing for Danbury. I did the Bristol show. And then I think it was either that weekend or the next weekend, he called me up and said, hey, can you make it to Newburgh? Made it to Newburgh, and then I was on every Northeast Wrestling event, I believe, until 2014. So I think I went 7 years without missing a show.
That's tremendous. First time I would have seen you was in Newburgh, was the one with Ric Flair and Jimmy Hart and the 8-man tag. I think it was with Reed Flair.
Yeah, so that was probably 2009-ish. But yeah, I started with Northeast in 2007.
Wow. I think that was the first one I actually went to. So, gosh. I've been going to these for 13 years now. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking before we started recording here. You were asking me about the pictures on the wall behind me and stuff. And you just brought up the Reed Flair thing, Ric Flair. It's like to think that in 2009 I was working with Ric Flair and Reed, and I think I was one of Reed's last opponents, if not his last opponent. And I was saying to you about all these pictures, like I've had this stuff, and for the longest time never did anything with it. And I finally came to terms with, what am I doing? I have all these great memories. So, one of the pictures that's behind me is from that event with Rick. And, I think back and I'm just like lucky to have gotten to do such cool things. I think that night you're talking about, I teamed with Trevor Murdoch and we took on Reed and Jerry the King Lawler, and, Rick was at ringside. So, you look back on these things and it's just amazing to me.
What were some of your other favorite moments that you got to do in NEW? You have a ton.
Man, I seriously, I couldn't pick one. I mean, if I had to pick one, obviously it was, my first championship win there when I beat Matt Taven and Waterbury in that cage match. That really meant a lot to me, still does mean a lot to me. Like I said, I always wanted to be in Northeast Wrestling, and then went from being told I wouldn't be used to being on every event for years, probably driving Michael crazy. So to finally get that opportunity to not only wrestle, for the championship, but to win it was awesome. And the crowd was ready for it. And, going into that match, they weren't loving me so much, but by the end of it, they kind of did that 180 where they were cheering and they wanted to see it and they got it. And that was a pretty memorable moment. But I've got a laundry list of things Northeast Wrestling has given me the opportunity to do. Obviously, working with Ric Flair was one of the greatest nights of my life. I mean, growing up a wrestling fan, loving Rick, how could you not, cherish that moment? Gotten to work with Cody Rhodes, grew up a big Hardy Boys fan. Got to work Jeff, wrestled Matt in a ladder match, really like, it doesn't get any better than this stuff. And, listen, I owe Northeast Wrestling a huge debt of gratitude because they have given me opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. Yeah, man, I could go on all day. I mean, I got to work with Roddy Piper. You know, I've wrestled Jerry Lawler so many times I've lost count. And, you know, I've had my favorite matches in my career in Northeast, specifically, you know, with Matt Taven. Some of those were just fantastic. Wrestled Danny Maff, Eddie Kingston. I mean, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And just the list goes on and on and on. And I could go on for hours about, you know, my favorite Northeast wrestling moments. That could be its own.
Yeah, that could be its own show. That'll be the next time you're on. You mentioned a little bit about how you broke in. I know that you were trained. You said you were trained by first Jason Knight, I guess it was, and then Paul Roma. What was your beginning like, and kind of what were your goals back then?
You know, I think everyone's goal when you break into wrestling is you want to be in the big time. So, you know, I got out of high school and I was going to college. I was working. And I remember telling my parents, like, I really want to do this wrestling thing. And they said, yeah, you know, find, you know, whatever. Weren't really thrilled about it. But, you know, I looked around and found Jason's school in Waterbury. So I talked them into it. And they said, all right, you can do it as long as you're still working, going to school, whatever. Fine. Well, the school thing didn't last too long. I hated it. So I started doing the wrestling. So I would go to school in the morning. I would work part-time in the afternoon, and then I would drive up to Waterbury at like 7, 8 o'clock at night to train at Jason's. And if anybody knows Jason's training style, like, let's just say it wasn't your typical wrestling school. I mean, I would go up there and I would just get beat up. I think I mentioned earlier, that's where I met Kurt. Mercedes Martinez used to come down a lot. Ron Zombie. Luckily for those three, and I probably have never thanked them enough. They pretty much saved me from that place because it was a rough time, man. Like, I was going there, I wasn't learning a whole lot except how to get beat up. My first event that I did was under that banner. Jason Knight ran a small company based out of Waterbury. We did a show. I ended up getting my jaw shattered. I was like 18 years old. And yeah, just after that, I remember, you know, coming home, I'm 18, talked to my parents and let me do this wrestling thing. And now my jaw's wired shut. And they're like, you're not doing this anymore. You don't want to do this anymore. You know, they're basically trying to talk me out of it without telling me that I can't do it. And so naturally, that made me want to do it even more. Went back, still the same goals in mind. You know, you eventually want to be like in the big time, WWE at the time, you know, Ring of Honor, Impact. Like, those are my goals, you know. And as I've grown up, you know, obviously AEW came around, WWE's gotten bigger. So, you know, that's always was the dream, always was the goal. But you know what, man, being in Northeast Wrestling for as long as I've been and doing the things that, you know, we just talked about, it's been a great run, man.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, that was going to be part of my next question, was just how the goals for you have changed over time. To me, you're one of the most successful wrestlers around because you've gotten to wrestle. I started making my own list, even independently of your list, but, you know, I had Eddie Kingston on there. I know you've worked with and against David Arquette, which not many people can say that they've done. You mentioned the Hardys, Darby Allin. Pretty much anybody who passes through the company, you know, you're the guy they ultimately have any interaction with. So, you know, it's to me, success is sort of relative to the individual and what you want to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Phil, you know, there's still a part of me that deep down, like, I would love it. You know, if WWE rang my phone tomorrow, I'd be picking up. I'd be, you know, doing whatever I can to get there. Same thing, AEW. But like you said, I've managed to have this fulfilling wrestling life where I've gotten to do all these amazing things. And, you know, you brought up some people I left off that list, Arquette being one of them. I mean, what a guy he is. I mean, I had more fun working with and against David Arquette than arguably anybody that I've been in a ring with. And the guy's not even a wrestler. I mean, he would tell you himself, like, I don't know what I'm doing out there. You know, you got to get me through this. But no, it's just, you know, I went from being full-fledged that this is going to be my life. I am getting signed. I'm going to make a living at this. You know, I had my whole life mapped out in my head. You know, like, I was putting off buying a house, putting off getting married, putting off doing all these things until I got signed. And, you know, you reach a point where, okay, maybe it's not going to happen. Maybe it is, but I still have to move on. So some of those things that, you know, I wasn't as committed to, such as, you know, getting married, buying a house, getting, you know, a stable job, at some point you have to do those things. And so as I've grown, you know, I have all those things now. I'm married. I have responsibilities. I have a great job. It does make it difficult to put as much time and effort into trying to get signed now as, say, 10 years ago. But, you know, as an adult, I feel like I made decisions, whether it was getting a job that made it more difficult to wrestle or getting married, which makes it more difficult to leave all the time. You know, whatever it may be, I've had this amazing balance, specifically with Northeast Wrestling, which is why I'm so loyal to them, why I love working there, where I've been able to fulfill, you know, what I need out of wrestling, like working with all these guys and doing these great things and having these awesome memories and still have a great life. You know, I have a job that provides me a great life. You know, I'm sorry to ruin the mystique, and, you know, but it's 2022. I think most people know that if you're just doing local independence, you probably do have a job outside of wrestling. So sorry to ruin the magic, but that's reality, you know, and it's tough. You know, it's still embedded in me that I would love to make a living wrestling, but again, a great job, you know, that requires me to be there a lot of hours, unfortunately. So it's not easy to just say, hey, I'm taking off on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday to go wrestle. Especially because I work weekends, but it's also hard to explain when you come in banged up on Monday, or, you know, you're injured, or you got stitches in your head and you're, you know, working with the public. It's not easy to always explain that. So over the past year or two, I definitely have taken a step back, but a lot of that too is just due to getting older, being banged up. But, you know, it's still, you know, the dream, so to speak, getting signed, but it is definitely harder at this point in my life to devote the time to do it. And that's just a fact.
Yeah, and I know when we had Eddie Kingston on, he specifically name dropped you as somebody that he enjoyed working with on his brief sojourn into NEW, and I imagine he'll be back eventually too, because it seems like he had a great time there.
He better be, because he still hasn't pinned me. He's walking around saying he beat me. He pinned Vito. He didn't pin me.
That's great. You know, and another thing about your whole persona too, and a big part of what wrestlers do involve marketing and branding. And you know, when I think of neon green, I think of Brian Anthony. I believe you drive a neon green truck. You're pretty much surrounded by neon green all the time. And I did not expect that I'd be conducting this interview when I wrote this question out, that you'd be sitting on a neon green couch in your basement. So
yeah, man, you got to do it. You know, it's devotion.
How did all that come about for you? Like, where did neon green start? And, you know, you have so many little things that you have available for fans at the shows too. So, you know, where does this part come into it for Brian Anthony?
Yeah, honestly, man, it didn't start as like this idea that I'm just going to make everything in my life neon green. It just kind of slowly happened. When I first started to develop my first set of ring gear, my dog's joining us in the background here. But when I first started to, you know, make my first set of ring gear, it was actually dark green and purple when I designed it. And I remember thinking to myself, like, this is really, you know, it's like dark and needs something to pop. So I changed the colors to neon green. And when it came, I just went 100% full-fledged in with it. So then everything became lime green, because I started, you know, to wear the green, and, you know, then I would see people bring green signs, you know, things like that. I'm like, all right, this is kind of catching on. So then it was just, you know, full steam ahead. Everything was green. Like you said, I got the green truck, put my logo on the doors. You know, I want people to know, you know, when they're at a show, oh, Brian's here, you know, hopefully they think that's cool. When we did the stadium shows, I would drive the truck down to the ring, or, you know, in Danbury, one of my hometown events, you know, they had the roll up door, like drive the Jeep in. And then it was great because the kids would all associate the Jeep with me because of the color. You know, my shirts are all green. My headbands are green. Like you said, the merchandise I sell, I have, you know, lime green dog tags, lime green bracelets, lime green shirts, lime green hats. It's all about branding for me. I want people to recognize me with that color. And specifically the vehicle, because it became a marketing tool for me. So they'd see me drive it to the ring, and then the kids would all want to take pictures of me in front of us. So, you know, that's a pretty great photo op when you're going to an independent wrestling show. Hey, my kid wants to get a picture with you, and I've got the green Jeep behind me with the logo, and they're holding the belt on their shoulder. I mean, what's cooler than that? I wanted to create something that would excite people, especially early on in my career. I really marketed myself and, you know, pushed myself towards kids, because I remember being a kid bothering my mom to go to these WWE shows, whether it was a house show or whatever. And I always wanted to buy the merchandise. I was telling you, before we came on the air here that, my basement, behind me is a small part of it. I'm a big time vintage wrestling collector. So my whole basement is vintage wrestling stuff. And a lot of that is stuff that I bought as a kid at the events and what have you. So I always wanted to create something that, kid's going to go to the show and say, wow, I want that, and I think I've done a good job of that.
Yeah. And I enjoyed during your run as King that you had an entire court of guys. Now, wrestlers don't all get their gear from the same place.
Right.
So you've got all of these. You had Anthony Battle. You had the Duke of Danger, Daniel Evans. You had Baron Von Vito, of course.
Yeah.
Am I missing anybody else that was in the court? David Arquette ended up in there eventually.
Man. The Amazing Graysons.
Both Graysons, that's right too.
Yep.
But they all needed to be neon too. So they had to go along with the Brian Anthony brand.
It's actually funny you mentioned that because I'm a little nuts about things like that. Like I have always loved, ever since I was a kid, if there's a group of wrestlers or a tag team, I've always wanted them to have, matching gear. Like if guys don't match, it drives me nuts. So when we formed that group, I actually hand drew all the gear for everybody, for the Graysons, for me, for Dan, for Anthony, and just placed one big order with one person because I wanted all to make sure that the greens matched, the purples matched, all that stuff. And I'm a little bit of a nut where I don't really throw things away. I save a lot of things. So somewhere in a bin, I have the original drawings of that. I'll have to try and dig those out and send them to you. Maybe you can pop them up on the screen or something. I know you tech guys can do all fancy stuff, but yeah. So I actually have like a lot of the drawings of all my gear has been designed by me. So I have somewhere a box of drawings that I've done. And I think I was telling you earlier, I'm not the most tech savvy guy. So they are literally drawn on like the back of paper bags and colored in with crayons because me trying to do it on Photoshop would not be good.
That's great about the creative side of wrestling. And then on another, topic with that too, tweaking your persona is a big part of wrestling. And you've had several changes from like the neon green heel guy to the Army of One, and then the King of Bethany, and now what you are now. What kind of process do you go through as you make those various changes to your character? It's a fluid situation every time. Like you were saying, I mean, if you think about it. So when I first came in, I was kind of, a heel, just trying to find myself. And then when I won the championship from Matt Taven, I had a run of 4 or 5 years there. Probably 4 years where I was just the white bread baby face, kissing babies, high-fiving people. You know what I mean? Indy Cena, I believe some fans refer to it.
Yeah, and it got to the point where towards the end of that run, that the crowd would chant Indy Cena, and I'm thinking to myself, this is great. What's a better compliment than that? Meanwhile, they were slowly starting to do that 180 again, where they were like, all right, we're kind of tired of this guy. So, I lost the title to Matt Taven, and I said, all right, well, obviously this babyface thing is not going to continue to evolve the way it was. Like they were pretty much done with me. And I've always believed that characters work. I'm not one of these guys that prides themselves on being able to do crazy flips and the stuff you see, on TV now. So I've always tried to hide that, not hide it, but, accentuate the
positive, right? Yeah.
Which is my character stuff. And, I remember doing the Army of One thing, saying to Michael Lombardi, like, I don't even know if I want to come back because I don't know what to do. And it was him that was like, just come to the show. I'm going to give you a microphone and just say why you're pissed off. Because I was pissed off. I remember being like angry, not at anyone, but literally just didn't understand why, and it sounds so silly, but I didn't understand why, as hard as I was working, people were starting to boo me and kind of get tired of me. And so Michael gave me the opportunity. He was like, just go out and talk. And to say how you really feel, I think that resonates. So that whole run of just being angry really resonated because a lot of what I was saying was really how I felt. And then, that ran its course and Ron Zombie beat me in the casket match. And then I, disappeared for a little while. So when I came back, I was, back to good guy Brian. And I kind of felt that it wasn't going to last. And I was right, because 2 or 3 shows into it, they're excited at first, you're back.
Yeah.
And 2 or 3 shows in, I started to feel it weaning already. And I remember pitching the whole idea to Northeast Wrestling about this King thing. And they were not having it. Nope, we're not doing that. That's not you. And I think, to his credit, it was Matt Taven. I remember I was at the event and I was pitching the idea to Matt Taven, and he's like, this is great. He's like, why aren't we doing this? And he went and was talking to Michael Lombardi about it. I was still talking to Michael about it. And finally he just caved and he's like, all right. And I think the first time I went out to the ring and I had the crown and it was a work in progress. Like, my wife actually was like still sewing me a cape and a green crown, but none of it was ready yet. So I just have like the generic red crown and I'm out there and I started just talking with the accent. And I remember I came to the curtain and everyone was dying laughing because nobody knew I was going to do that. They just expect me to go out there and do my normal promo. So once I started doing it and the fans were reacting the way they were, I remember I was like, oh, this might be a hit.
Yeah, it was really good. And for those of you who haven't seen it, check it out on High Spots because it's gold. I always personally enjoyed the how everybody was still doing all of that stuff at the table before the show. Like I'd walk past you, there'd maybe be, the doors had just opened. There maybe be 25 people had walked in the building because they're still all doing their own thing, getting in. And you'd be like, oh, here's Phil Strong and his fine scribe. And I'm like, what is he doing?
Hey, man, honestly, I know it seemed crazy, but, I remember even talking to Vito. I'm like, we can't just go out there and sell merchandise. I said, I didn't even care about the money of selling merchandise. I cared about the process of it. And I remember us having a conversation, and to Vito's credit, he was the one that said to me, he's like, we need to be as annoying as humanly possible. He's like, we need to get our heat before the bell rings because, and to Vito's credit, again, he knew especially at this point in my life, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point, but I've dealt with a million injuries. And at that point too, when I was doing that whole King gimmick was probably when I was at my worst because I was dealing with some serious neck issues. So Vito knew that my matches weren't always necessarily going to be, 5-star classics and probably the best on the show. And we also did a good job of hiding that too. If you look back, a lot of that King run was tag matches, 8-man tags, 6-man tags, things like that. But, the thought process was let's be as annoying as possible, but we were smart about it where, I was selling, I don't know if you remember, but I had like thousands of lime green paper crowns made up.
Yep.
And it was the greatest thing I ever did. It was probably the best selling piece of merchandise I've had in my entire career because the kids either loved them and wanted to have them because it was something they could wear, or people were buying them and just like rip them up and throw them at Vito at ringside. It was the best of both worlds because I'm like, to be honest, when people would start coming in, Vito would be on the megaphone harassing people, and we would look for the kids to get them going. Because once you get one kid that, is yelling at you and harassing you at ringside, all the other ones are going to join in.
Yep.
On the other side of that, the first kid that buys the crown, all the other kids want a crown now. So it was the best of both worlds. They either hated us or loved us, and I sold a ton of those things. So I'm sure somewhere out there's a bunch of kids with lime green crowns, hanging up in their room somewhere.
I love it. It's just one of my favorite parts of your whole persona is just
and we made
attention
a point
to detail.
We made a point too. Like, I don't know if you recall, but even at the merchandise, we didn't just like do it in the lobby. We would actually we would wait till people were inside and we would have people carry the table out to make a big presentation out of it. And Vito would, get on the megaphone and be, oh, King Brian is now opening the Royal Marketplace. It would make this whole presentation out of the autograph signing. And so the guys would be carrying the table. Vito's introducing me. Naturally, people are walking in like, what is this guy? Who is this jerk? You know what I mean? If they didn't know me, they were just immediately like, this guy's a jerk. And then, we'd have the lime green tablecloth on there. I mean, it was just a spectacle. All the guys would be in their gear too,
Yep.
We just tried to make a spectacle out of it. And that way, when we did finally hit the ring, man, they wanted to kill us already before the bell rang.
Absolutely fantastic. So we're going to move on to something we call the 3 count now. It's going to be 3 quick questions and your answers. So the first one, you've wrestled a ton of big stars in your career. Who didn't you wrestle who you would have liked to have shared the ring with?
Oh, man. 2 guys right off the top of my head. Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig, as a kid, was one of my favorites. Man, I would have loved to have done anything with Kurt. Never got the chance. The other one, Macho Man, Randy Savage. Growing up as a kid, loved Macho Man. As a vintage wrestling collector, I've got probably 100 different Macho Man items down here. I never got to wrestle Hulk Hogan, but got to share a locker room with him. It was on that stadium show where him and Roddy Piper had their last ever encounter. That was a dream, just being able to chat with Hulk. I mean, actually, one of these pictures behind me here it's me and Hulk, posing, and what's better than that as a kid growing up as a Hulkamaniac? But yeah, Kurt Hennig and Macho Man are the 2 that come to my mind right away. I grew up, like I said, Hulkamaniac, Randy Savage fan. As I got a little older, the Attitude Era, loved Stone Cold Steve Austin. He's one guy I've never gotten to do anything with, but he doesn't do much of anything, nor does he have to. So that's probably off the table.
The world of Northeast wrestling has very few limits. I've learned over the last 15 years.
You are not wrong there. But yeah, those 2 guys are the first 2 that come to mind. Going through my fandom, I said like Hogan, Macho Man. Then as the new generation came along, I was huge into Bret Hart, but I've gotten to work with Bret numerous times at Northeast events. I went out and did StarCast a couple times, worked with Bret both times out there. He was as cool as could be. So I've got to work with him in some capacity, which was cool. I always loved in the new generation era. I was always a Tatanka guy. I love Tatanka, but never got to work with him. So that'd be cool. He's
still floating around.
Yeah, he's still out there. I'd love to do that, man. I remember pitching it actually a few times when I was doing the King deal. Like, I thought that would have been great to wrestle Tatanka as the King.
So, second question: aside from Brian Anthony, who are your 3 favorite wrestling kings?
Oh, Jerry Lawler, number 1. As many times as we've wrestled and as many times as he's beat me, he's still my favorite. He's number 1. Number 2, got to go with the King of Hearts, baby, Owen Hart.
Yeah,
he's another guy that would be on my list of guys I wish I could have worked with, but yeah, no, I loved Owen as King. I think he did the best job ever with winning that tournament. I mean, nobody can ever, duplicate what he did. It was unbelievable. I mean, just everything about it, the crown he had, the robe, and just when he had it on his gear, I mean, he really took it and went the whole mile with it. And then I think the third one, just because I stole so much of, not stole, but based so much of what I did as Wrestling King off of him, was King Booker.
Yeah.
I loved King Booker. I think that was, I'm probably in the minority, but I think that was the most entertaining run of his whole career. I loved it.
I'm trying to think. I don't think he was around at all during your King run in Northeast.
He was. And actually at I think at one point at one of the Six Flags shows, there was talk of him doing something where he was going to interrupt me and he was going to bring back the King Booker thing. I don't remember why it didn't work out. I think I wound up with Boogeyman and he might have wormed Vito or something. I can't remember, but we did talk about it and it did almost happen, but for some reason it didn't.
And then the last question, finally, if you were setting up a Brian Anthony DVD, what would be the main 2 or 3 matches on there for you?
We talked about it briefly earlier. Some of my favorite matches ever were with Matt Taven. I think every one of my matches with him would probably be on there. The cage match specifically. We had a ladder match, which was probably, the best match I had ever in Northeast, in my opinion. That would definitely be on there. And then just, some of the guys, me and Jeff, me and Matt, me and Darby had some real good ones. You got to put Hacksaw on there just because it's Hacksaw. He's got to go on there. And then some of my later stuff, definitely, some of the stuff with Kingston and Danny Maff and probably the Arquette stuff, just because I was so proud that it was so passable. I think it was actually better than passable. I think it was arguably good.
I enjoyed the heck out of it, and I enjoyed getting to talk to you and him and Lawler around that time too. It was fun to be a part of that, and it was just, I mean, he was all in on that story.
You know, I'll be honest, that was probably that stretch working with him. You know, I was doing the King deal at the time, and just working with him was probably the most fun I ever had in my career. I remember just working with Jerry and working with Arquette, you know, simultaneously throughout most of that run. There was a good year where I worked primarily with those guys. It was so non-stressful. It was great. And like the first time I worked with Arquette, he teamed with Hurricane Helms, who I also love. Me and Hurricane have worked, you know, half a dozen times. We go way back. He's fantastic. Just love Shane so much. And just working with him is always so easy and just so non-stressful. And like that whole run of working with those guys was definitely the most fun I ever had in my career.
That was right here in Poughkeepsie, New York. I think it was you and Anthony Battle against Hurricane and Arquette at the community center over here. So very good. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today on Under the Ring Pro Wrestling Conversations. I'm really, really glad we got to do this, and let's do it again sometime in the future. I think
Phil, I'm telling you,
more ground we could cover.
Oh yeah, we got enough stuff to do 10 podcasts. Don't worry about it. This was a pleasure, man. Thank you again. I don't do a lot of these things, so this was really fun, and if the people are into it, we'll do it again, man.